Good evening and welcome to Northwood University's DeVos Graduate School of Management. My name is Lauren Bess and we are so welcome that you are here today for our speaker series. Tonight we have Dr. Peter Bush with us, who's going to talk about investment tips for 2023. And Dr. Peter Bush has over 20 years in the automotive and financial services industry. Over 10 years focused on operations, finance, where he was responsible for the leadership of global business units and the implementation of financial operations best practices throughout the corporate manufacturing environment. His most recent experience was in corporate treasury, where he was responsible for financial risk management, policy development, and implementation.
All right. Thank you very much and appreciate that. I'm glad that all of you are here tonight. So excited to be here. So if you look at the topic and the subject that's in the subject line, right? I decided over the last couple of days to switch it up a bit, right? I mean, clearly in the last few weeks we've had quite a bit of turbulence in the banking industry, and obviously a lot of consternation in markets. People concerned. I did a couple interviews with newspapers and the like relatively recently, the last few days, about concerns with bank runs and issues with stability in the banking industry, which are warranted concerns. I mean, clearly some issues came up pretty quickly. I want to say somewhat unexpectedly, but certainly pretty quickly. And from that there was a great deal of turbulence, not only in the industry itself, but in global macro markets as well. And so I thought, rather than just do a generic discussion on investing in this environment, to me it made more sense to do it through a global banking lens, simply because it's been quite the topic of late. So anyway, so once again, if you do not know me, I am Dr. Peter Bush. I've been here at Northwood for 5 years. Been, as Lauren mentioned, 20 years in corporate. Quite a bit of experience, especially my last chunk of experience in corporate was on the treasury side. So I was dealing with major global banks every day, which is the second reason why I decided to shift this up a little bit, simply because I do know many people in the industry. I've worked with all of the top 10 global banks through the years. I've worked with a lot of regional and other banks in various countries around the world. So I do know the industry quite well, and a lot of people in it. And so I thought it was a worthy discussion from that perspective. But also when we think about general market stability, certainly there is a backdrop of banks and the financial industry providing liquidity in the market. And so when there's a concern about liquidity in that industry, it has a pretty rapid ripple effect that permeates through the industry. Of course, we also have the backdrop of the Fed and the actions they've been taking since last year. They did another quarter point move today. So all of this, I think, is quite interesting, and it does kind of lead on a path back to what the original, title of this presentation was. But we're coming to it in a little bit of a different way. So, in terms of an overview, what I'm going to talk about today, and certainly at the end, I'm hoping you have some questions, because questions are always far more interesting than talking to just a script. But we'll talk about some of the key events over the past few weeks. I'm going to flip through some of them, and really what I think is quite interesting is the too big to fail banks and what they've been doing throughout the last almost 2 weeks now. I think, well, it has been 2 weeks now, so it's quite intriguing, right? To me, it's a very different role they're playing, and I think it's interesting to ponder that into the future and what their role is in the economy. So we'll talk a bit about that. We'll talk about the regulatory environment, the support system, what's there, what worked, what didn't, etc. We could talk about the larger landscape of banking itself, but it's not just banking, right? Because there are other issues that have been brewing and kicking around and such, and many of these things are intertwined, right? I mean, we're talking about macro global financial markets. There is no such thing as pods of events and industries that are running kind of unilaterally without influence from others. So anytime there is an issue or even concern that there could be an issue, it does have an impact across the economy. And we've had a number of different things happening over the last few years, that have created some degree of instability, volatility that certainly are worth talking about. And then at the end, we'll talk about investing in the banking industry and the perspective of whether or not that's a good idea. But let's start really with this crisis, right? I call it a crisis. I don't really believe it's an actual crisis, but when I look at kind of what's been happening for the last couple of weeks, and as I mentioned, we are 2 weeks in from Wednesday, March 8th. We had a couple of things happen pretty quickly, some of which were potentially real issues, I would say, and other ones were perceived. So we had a bank called Silvergate Capital, a crypto-focused bank that essentially just kind of ceased operations and wrapped up on March 8th. And a smaller issue in the grander scheme here. Not that it doesn't matter, but it is a crypto-focused bank, and we've seen a bit of consternation around cryptos. Just in case you didn't know or you haven't been to any one of my presentations before, cryptocurrencies are one of my main wheelhouses in terms of research and things that I find of interest in where I do presentations. So at least from that perspective, I think that, a crypto-focused bank kind of going belly up on March 8th is interesting. That being said, there's a lot of things that are evolving, in cryptos in the industry that are going to continue to change, right? I would still consider it largely a newbie in terms of an industry, and it's still evolving a bit, and there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that still need to be figured out. And because of that, it doesn't surprise me a great deal that Silvergate went down, nor do I consider it all that concerning, to be honest, from the larger macro perspective. Now, what is concerning is Silicon Valley, right? So, and the way it went down on really the 8th and the 9th, through those couple of days was rather bizarre, for lack of a better word. So, one of the challenges that that SVB was facing was a liquidity shortage or potential shortage, and they moved forward to liquidate some assets in order to shore up their liquidity, right? And that's not the end of the world, right? There's nothing wrong with doing that per se, right? Other than a couple of other underlying issues. The first underlying issue is that in the rate environment that we've had over the last year or so, with increasing rates by the Fed, with SVB liquidating assets, they liquidated assets that created a loss condition for them, right? Meaning that you wouldn't choose. So one of the concerning signs to the market was you wouldn't choose to do that unless you had to. Right, meaning that you're holding on to, to assets, to financial assets that when you're making a logical choice to liquidate them, that especially when you're going to take a loss on them, that's a bit of a red flag to the market that you clearly are having a little bit of a liquidity issue, and you're just biting the bullet in terms of your, the impact on your P&L in order to shore up liquidity. Once again, not the end of the world. However, the way it was perceived by the market was not good. One of the things that I noted in one of the newspaper interviews that I did was that, to me, this might be the first bank run that's been a social media driven bank run. I'm trying to think back of other. 2008 was too early. That was not a social media event. This certainly felt like a social media event, meaning that, when, the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, tweeted out, some of the things he tweeted out that week, it created a bit of a panic, right? I wouldn't call it an overt panic, but certainly a degree of a panic where people were concerned about their, the funds they had deposited at FVB. And the minute that happens, people try to go and pull their money, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? This is where bank runs are born. What I think was really interesting, and some of the things that I've heard over the past week or so, is if you think about SVB, right? So Silicon Valley Bank, heavily tech bank. They also do a lot with the wine industry in California and such. So they have a lot of tails there. Um, so certainly because of their heavy tech influence and all of that, there are a number of various funds, hedge funds, and other major investors that have money or investments with SVB, and Bill Ackman being one of them. On Thursday, the night suggested they needed a bailout, and he very quickly took action to get his exposure closed by taking his money out, right? My read on that, and I've been watching interviews, not with just him, with others over the past week or so, is that they're certainly promoting what they did as being active for their investor base and making the right move. I view it a bit differently from the third party seat, right? I look at the actions they took as the likely cause of this run on SVB. If you look at their financials, if you look at their liquidity position leading up to the 9th and into Friday the 10th, they weren't in dire territory until these actions began to happen, and it became a bit of a contagion. So unfortunately, regardless of the kind of root cause, SVB failed on March 10th, which was Friday. Almost 2 weeks ago here, regulators took control of the bank in the middle of the day, which is quite different. Usually regulators, if they're going to step in, and it was California regulators that shut down SVB, they took action like noon on Friday, which is rather odd. But certainly they took rather rapid action. Of course, this type of action, which were regulators stepping in, and you could say that the safety net kind of took hold, including the FDIC. But of course, the minute that action happened, you had a bit of, once again, I don't want to use the word panic, but you certainly had concern throughout Wall Street about the industry as a whole, right? And so you saw a number of other banks really kind of take the brunt of this as well. Signature Bank in New York being one of those that saw a major outflow of deposits on Friday the 10th. And so it really started. The problem with bank runs is, if it starts in one place and one bank or one regional gets hit, especially in a social media market like we have now, there's a potential it could run very quickly out of control. And certainly I believe the regulators saw that, right? Concerns that this thing could very quickly get legs and start running. And so they did take pretty rapid action, right? So on Sunday, March 12th, which is 2 days later, and a Sunday, might I note, regulators seized Signature Bank to alleviate any contagion fears. And the Fed, Treasury, and FDIC were working jointly with state regulators throughout this process. So if there's one thing to be said, right? There's a couple things to be said, but there's one thing to be said. I think some of these agencies, proved that they were able and willing to take quick action. The FDIC particularly, and the FDIC, it's almost 100 years old now. It's been around quite some time, but it is one of the single, largest creators of stability in the banking industry because of their protection for deposits, right? And because of that, it makes people feel more comfortable about their deposits in banks. So I'm not going to read every one of these bullets, but March 13th on Monday, so the president came out, announced that banks are safe. You had, there was a lot of turbulence in the market. Certainly regional banks got beat up pretty quickly. First Republic was down 60%. So there's a lot of, kind of things going on. HSBC announced it would buy SVB's British subsidiaries. There was a lot of stuff happening at once. Not terribly surprising with that. We've seen that, through the too big to fail bank era, where a lot of these regional banks are not doing very well. Some of them are failing. Some of them are being, acquired. So we saw, so of course, the minute there's a concern of that nature, these regionals get beat up pretty quickly. Not that the entire industry didn't get beat up that Monday, but certainly saw some of these regionals get beat up pretty bad. March 15th, Credit Suisse announcement came out that they had some material deficiencies in their financial reporting, which is a major concern. I mean, I would call that one a real concern, right? In the sense that clearly they had some reporting irregularities. Certainly that quickly turned pretty negative inside Switzerland. And what we saw, so I think one of the interesting things that we saw, and it kind of leads into my next bullet point in my coverage here, is that on Thursday, March 16th, Credit Suisse received $30 billion in deposits from a whole bunch of too big to fail U.S. banks, including J.P. Morgan, Wells, and Morgan Stanley. Right. Plus, it also borrowed money from the Swiss Central Bank. So very quickly, they were attaining liquidity from multiple sources. But to me, one of the most important, interesting things is how the too big to fail banks have been acting through this period. Because in a way, if you look at, especially like JP, there's a lot of news reports out there and such about how Jamie Dimon, who's JP's CEO, has been very active in this process, providing guidance and support, strategic advice, obviously liquidity. So in a way, you've got some of these really large too big to fails like JP that seem to be taking a pseudo governmental role in a way. It's interesting. They're acting a bit like mini central banks. That is a little bit of a new phenomenon here, and what's happening. That's what I found really intriguing, because the concern since 2008, and really before that, but really since 2008, has been too big to fail banks are dangerous. The economy as a whole, if one of them goes down, it could take the entire economy down. I mean, we saw those concerns play themselves out in 2008, and certainly it's been a talk since then after Dodd-Frank and all of this that came into play. Some of the kind of looking back, right, 2020 a rear vision has been, well, geez, the too big to fail banks have only gotten larger since then, right? So do we have a concern, right? And so there's been a lot of talk around things like Basel III and such to try to kind of create stability and, kind of a regulatory framework in the market and all of that. Intriguing to me with the way they've been acting through this, we'll call it a crisis, right, through the turbulence. I don't necessarily know if it's a good or bad thing because it's just so new, but I think it's interesting, right? That is there a place for these large too big to fail banks in the marketplace where they do help provide stability, where they do act like maybe a bridge to central banks, right? Is there a place for that? And I think that's quite intriguing to see how this continues to play itself out. And the last data I put on here, I didn't run it all the way through today, but this past Sunday, UBS, which is the largest Swiss bank, agreed to take over Credit Suisse for $3.2 billion. Swiss Central Bank helped in that process, right, providing $100 billion of Swiss francs in support, and they also wiped out $17 billion of Credit Suisse bonds. So a lot of actions certainly were happening. And really, Sunday, but since then, right, central banks and the Treasury and others have been saying over and over and over again that they vow to provide liquidity into the market, that they will do anything it takes to ensure the stability of the market. And since then, we've seen a bit more stability, right? Over the last couple of days, we've seen a bit more stability. It seems that the fears are retreating a bit. That doesn't mean they're gone. Right? It doesn't mean that issues don't still exist. Clearly, with the Fed raising rates another, 25 basis points today, not surprising. I'm not at all surprised that they did. What I do think was once again interesting is the fact that they noted that they're about done raising rates, which I viewed that as a positive thing, right? I mean, they wouldn't say that unless they didn't feel like they had inflation relatively under control. They wouldn't say that. I was really surprised by how the markets reacted to it in a bit of a negative way. But once again, there's so many moving parts at the moment that it's kind of hard to read exactly how the market's going to react to certain things. So just quickly, the major changes we saw in the industry over a 2-week period, by the way, and some of these happened within days. Silicon Valley Bank, which is SVB, is no more. They were seized by regulators, and they're essentially being parceled out. Signature Bank, same thing, right? Seized by regulators, shut down. The FDIC has an agreement to sell the major assets of the bank, including its former 40 branches. So it looks like that's kind of in the chop shop phase at this point. And as I mentioned before, UBS took over Credit Suisse, right? So those are some pretty big. It's a pretty big deal in the industry. We'll just put it in perspective, right? We talk about the 2008 recession and the banking crisis back then and all these things. And yeah, we had one major bank failure, which was Washington Mutual at the time. But we've had two of the three largest U.S. bank failures in history happen in the last 2 weeks, which is Silicon Valley Bank, which is number two, and Signature Bank, which is right. So, there was a potential that could have spun out of control pretty quickly, particularly in a social media environment, right, where, I think it's pretty easy to see how fears and contagion can rapidly roll out of control. So it was very comforting to a degree to see how quickly regulators acted. It was also, as I mentioned before, intriguing to me how too big to fail banks like JP Morgan and such were acting in this. So I think there's a story still to be written, right? I mean, there's a lot of I think the turbulence is largely at the moment kind of simmered a bit. But I'm not sure exactly where it goes. So, as I said, one of the things that popped out of this to me that was really interesting is this whole too big to fail involvement in the process and the actions they took, right? Because they immediately took action to help stabilize the industry. They provided liquidity, pretty rapidly. They basically said, hey, Signature, we can provide liquidity here. We can certainly with Credit Suisse providing liquidity. So, they very quickly provided funds. First Republic, they provided $30 billion. So, they clearly saw that, there was market concern about liquidity, and, they stepped up and took some very quick action to help alleviate some of those concerns. Once again, the story is yet to be written. It's still relatively new, so I can't see into the boardroom of the discussions that were happening. But it'll be interesting to see how, when we learn more about what was happening there, what the thought process was. Why did they do that? Did they feel that they were in a position where they could kind of end this issue before it really got off the ground too far? Were they compelled to? Did the Fed ask them to? Or did they come to the Fed with this, or the Treasury with this idea to do it? Meaning, did they work unilaterally, or were they working collaboratively with government agencies? Right. It's hard to tell. I don't think the whole story's out. There's lots of different bits and pieces all over the place. But I mean, clearly they were all singing the same tune, right? Between the Treasury and the Fed and the too big to fail banks and President Biden and everybody else, they were all saying the same thing, which was liquidity is going to be fine. We will do what it takes to make sure liquidity is there. Your deposits are safe. They were all saying the same thing. So either it just played out that way, or they were working together. But either way, it seems to have been effective, right? And that is, to me, quite interesting, right? And so, I mean, it certainly brings up questions about the relationship between banks and the federal government. It's been my personal view since the recession that, that big banks like the too big to fails, JP and these others have been largely acting pseudo-governmental to a degree anyway for quite a period of time. So it's just been my personal opinion that there is a relationship there, that there's a symbiotic one, right? Meaning that one hand seems to support the other depending on what's happening. There seems to be a bit of that going on. From a long-term perspective, I don't know if that's good or bad, but there certainly seems to be something going on there. And I think that's pretty interesting to me, right? And so I think it's going to take, some time, some research, some interviews and all of that to truly understand it. But my last bullet on this slide is, should we no longer be concerned about too big to fail banks? That's not a statement, that's a question. right? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, because that has been the big concern of the banking industry. Yeah, we know that smaller banks and regionals and such have been failing and being acquired, but to me, that's just been a slow migration toward a more universal banking model. That doesn't surprise me, but it's never taken off the table the fact that, hey, what happens if a major too big to fail bank has a major issue? What happens to the economy? It doesn't matter which bank it is. Do they have too much power? And we've seen, from the negative side, right? I'm giving them credit right now for what they did here. Once again, whether they did it unilaterally or they were just kind of coerced into it, whatever it may be, fine. But at least I'm giving them credit for the actions they took here to shore up the industry pretty quickly. At the same time, right? I'm not going to hand them a trophy tomorrow. At the end of the day, all of these too big to fail banks have been involved in countless scandals over the past 15 years. That tarnishes their image and their reputation, right? So it's a two-edged sword, and I think it's rather intriguing as we look forward into the future marketplace, how that changes. And of course, I didn't put it on here because I said I'm trying to stay kind of in the wheelhouse of this discussion. But I did mention cryptos earlier, right? So what happens, in future state if we do have more cryptos taking hold, and how do these too big to fail banks play in that pool? And is it a major threat to them, and how that plays out? There's a lot of things that are worthy of discussion there. A lot of the answers we don't have yet because there's a lot in moving still, but I think it's quite interesting. In terms of regulators and oversight, everybody beats up the government every day, right? This is what we do, right? This seems to be a pastime of people for thousands of years, is to point at the government and say they're a bunch of inept, well, what's, right? That, it's easy. They're easy targets. It's the government, right? And believe me, there's plenty of things you can point at. They don't do very well or very efficiently or very effectively because they are governments at the end of the day, right? They're not really designed to be efficient. But so there's plenty of things that we can beat up governmental agencies for, and bad things that they've done and inaction across the board over years, right? So believe me, I'm not like Mr. Friend of the Government here. But that being said, right, what we did see here, at least from a couple of agencies, specifically the FDIC, is some pretty quick action. Right. Now, certainly it was state regulators that jumped in California with SVB, but certainly with the FDIC in tow along with it. Right. And so, they did do some things, the FDIC specifically, that helped create stability sooner than I thought it would happen. Right. I think they saw the need to take action over that weekend, and that they could not get to Monday and not have some type of resolution in place and public, because it would have probably been a market meltdown even worse than it was on Monday. And so clearly they saw that, which is good, and they were able to move forward and get some actions in place and be able to stabilize before we got into Monday. And I think that was pretty critical to get that done. And once again, maybe not the most eloquent solution, right? Maybe there's other things that could have been done. Once again, there'll be scads of research around this that we can look back at in time. But at the end of the day, at least they did take action, and they did recognize the fact that stability was needed before Monday, and they were able to do that, which good. Right? There were a lot of coordinated efforts by agencies, both from federal agencies, state regulators, and also I mentioned, the FDIC, but the Fed, Treasury, right? These are all different agencies. A lot of them worked very quickly and seemingly relatively effectively together. And once again, we don't have insight into the back room. We don't know what else is going on. But what we do know is that whatever they were able to, herd the wild horses there, they were able to get something done, which is pretty good. Questions remain, of course. How could SVB and how could Signature fail so quickly? These were not banks that were teetering on the edge of, implosion before that, right? So how did it happen so quickly? So if there is a failure from the regulator side, Is it more likely? Is it more that they were not paying attention enough up front? Does it mean that the regulations weren't strong enough leading into this crisis? So all of that, I think, is certainly something that is open for discussion. So quickly, just moving on, I want to leave time for questions. So, the road ahead, where does the industry go from here? As I mentioned before, it's been my view that we're marching toward a universal banking model anyway. It's a slow march. I'm not going to be alive to see it, I don't think, right? I mean, it's a slow march that direction, but, more and more. And the question is that a bad thing? I mean, certainly people don't like major change of that nature, but most of the other countries in the world have something much closer to a universal banking model than we have in the U.S. So is our model better? Is it unique? I don't know. Are we experiencing the end to regional local banks? The end, I don't know, but we've been seeing them fail and get acquired at a rather rapid rate for a long time. Not terribly surprising. Yeah, they do serve a purpose, especially in rural areas. Where farmers and agriculture in general is heavily involved with some of the local and regional banks, and that's not a place where a lot of these too big to fail banks play so much. So, it does. There still is a place for some of these banks. That's the point. We talked about too big to fail banks already. Do we need further regulation? I mean, certainly that's going to come out of it, right? The question is, do we need further regulation? Do we need further stop gates? Right? Is there a way for us to see these issues happening before what happened? Yes. Regulators and these agencies and too big to fail banks were reactive and very quickly reactive. But reactive isn't good, right? At the end of the day, we want proaction. And so how do we get in front of it, right? How do we get into a situation where this doesn't happen in the first place? Did SVB need to fail, right? Did Signature need to fail, right? And I think those are the questions that will linger. In terms of deposits being safe in the U.S. banks, the answer to that is a resounding yes. I don't foresee anything that will change that. I mean, even a major too big to fail bank, at the end of the day, the Fed and the Treasury are what they are, right? They can make money appear from nowhere, so it's not like they're going to let, $2 billion of deposits disappear into the sky. That's not good for votes. That's not good for anything. That's not going to happen, right? So that you're just not going to see that. And one of the questions that's been kicking around is, has the Fed overstepped in its efforts to fight inflation? Clearly, inflation was a major problem. They've taken some pretty significant action. Have they overstepped? I don't know, right? I mean, that's the whole different Fed debate that we can have at some point, but certainly So in terms of the investment landscape, and this is the last slide I'm gonna cut through here before I ask questions, or let questions that you guys ask questions. I think we've largely reached the bottom. I've seen a number of articles the last couple of days about certain regionals being investment fodder. I agree. I think some banks got beat up way too much, and so there certainly is upside. I don't think, unless something else comes up that we have not seen yet, I don't think there's a major downside off of where we are right now. So from the general perspective, yeah, I think the industry is a pretty reasonable investment target at the moment. Whether it's fragmented or not, whether it's certain pieces of it, yes, no, sure, but I think some of the too big to fail banks that whose stock price got beat up a bit through this process, I don't think that was deserved, and so I think there's certainly upside with some of them. Bigger questions I have is the U.S. economy heading for a recession. I've been saying yes for over a year at this point, right? I'm still just waiting, not in a good way. I don't want it to happen, but I believe it is going to happen. I found this statistic on Monday. 93% of the CEOs believe a recession is coming. I agree with them, but I've been saying it long before most of them were. We'll see how that plays. I think the economy does need a bit of a purge. Not from this issue, but we still have supply chain issues and labor issues and inflation, and there's a lot of other stuff going on. And when you have that much chaos happening in the economy in a number of different realms, unfortunately, one of the ways to cure that, right, and the best way is the poison pill, right? You need a recession. You need to cleanse and kind of start fresh again. And so I do think that it will probably happen. The bigger concern right now, housing sales and the housing market. Housing sales are down 40% year over year. We see prices retracting a bit, kind of on a macro level, which is concerning, right? If you talk about a backdrop to the banking economy, the banking industry, which is a little bit concerning, it's that, right? There's still a lot of mortgage-backed instruments that are out there, and if the housing market gets beat up too much, and these banks are compelled to have to shed some of these assets, they're going to take major losses, and that's the potential for another kind of contagion to happen. So anyway, so that's, those are all of my points here. Just real quick, I snapped these. So these are major. I went after too big to fail banks, and I looked at their 1 month chart, right? I think I did this on Monday or Tuesday. It was Monday. So JP was down almost 10%. Citigroup was down over 13. Wells Fargo was down almost 21. Bank of America, similar. So certainly these too big to fail banks' stock price as of Monday got beat up pretty big over the last month. My view on I'm not a Wells fan, but outside of that, like JP, Citi, I certainly think there's upside off of it. So from the investment perspective, once again, it's intriguing, right? I think there's some potential. All right, so I guess I will kick it back to Lauren for any questions or help moderate us through the end of this process.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Bush. This was so phenomenal. And we do have a couple questions in the chat.
Awesome.
So I'll read them off to you. The first one is, what is your opinion on the initial reaction to the banking stocks drastically dropping? Do you feel it is an overreaction on par or underrated?
Overreaction, yes. That is one of the places where I've been doing research for almost 20 years now. Is investors. So I'm a behavioral finance guy, right? So at the end of the day, I'm very intrigued by how investors react to information and what they tend to do with it. There's a lot of research that would suggest that, especially with bad news, that investors tend to overreact out of the gate. Right. And so without having, gone through the math here and done all of that, but it's my view that, yes, I think there was an overreaction. And once again, as I said earlier, I think it was somewhat fueled by, well, the environment we live in now, which is social media and, Twitter and everything else. Right. Once this stuff starts rolling out there, people get nervous, right? Because it's in their face and it's being thrown at them and people get scared. And I get it. And they tend to react too quickly. And as I mentioned with Bill Ackman and some of the others, that the way they acted those first couple of days, honestly, shame on them, right? That they know better than what they did. And it's my view, when they take those actions, right, and they act, they say that they're acting in the best interest of their investors, but they know when they do that they are going to have a ripple effect through the market because other people are going to see what they're doing and get nervous. I just think it's the wrong thing to do. I think when you're in that position that you have a responsibility to the market as a whole, and that making that kind of trade, removing yourself from that situation is part of the reason why this. But yeah, I do believe there was overreaction.
So then there was a part two. Do you see the First Republic Bank of San Francisco taking the right steps to stabilize itself, or do you see it falling like the Silicon Valley Bank?
I don't think they'll let it fall at this point unless there's something that we haven't seen yet behind the scenes where there's a major issue, like just structurally, that we haven't seen with that bank. I think the fact that I mentioned the too big to fail banks and the actions they took to prop up and provide funding, liquidity to First Republic. I think that's a big step. That's a confidence step. Right. And so I don't think that's going to happen once again. The caveat being, from what I know now, I don't see that happen. Right. I don't think that any of these agencies are going to let that happen. I don't think JP and others are going to let that happen if they can help it. So unless there's a skeleton in the closet we're not seeing, which is entirely possible, I don't think we'll see First Republic.
Sure. We have another question. Powell mentioned inflation will be 3.1% by the end of 2024 or early 2025. Thought on that?
Yeah, but that's looking pretty far out. Yeah, I believe that's going to be the case. They raised rates tremendously over the last year. So certainly either that's going to work or the recession that I keep talking about is going to happen, which is going to help alleviate the problem, right? either way, I can't see us sitting, and he said, what, 2024 or 2025, and it's a long way out. I can't see us sitting here 2 years from now, right, with inflation kicking along at 8 or 9%. That's not going to be the case, right? And they will beg, borrow, and steal their way, right, just facetiously, right, to getting inflation back in the box, right, getting inflation back in a normal range. Whether they can do it effectively themselves through rates and other things, or if the economy helps them with things like a recession or other things. Yeah, I can't see it. I think it'll be sooner than that, to be honest with you. I honestly think that we will see, I think we'll see some type of recession, whether it's minor or not, plus all the rate increases that have happened already. I think we'll see inflation fall pretty quickly by later this year, to be honest with you, into early next year. So yeah, I think it's the way they generally speak. They're conservative, right? And so I think they're being ultra conservative with that. I can't imagine rates staying that high.
You mentioned that we are slowly marching towards a universal banking system. We have started to see consolidation of banks. Do you think this is a positive or negative situation?
The jury's out. I mean, if you look at most of the rest of the world, if you look at Europe, you look at other places, this is basically a model that they've been using long before we had a banking industry here in the States. So you would think, it's a model that's pretty tried and true and seems to be relatively stable. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's just different, especially different for this economy, right? But there's a lot of things that need to change to get there. We have a lot of things like state regulators and all these things that are in play that make it very convoluted at the moment. It's not like we can flip a switch and be to a pseudo universal banking system tomorrow. It's not going to happen, right? But I think it is a positive thing, because as banks tend to get larger, for the most part, it seems to promote stability. It's at least it seems to. Now, once again, other than 2008, right? It seems to be the case. So, yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing. There's going to be growing pains. There's going to be issues. You're going to have banks that get closed and sold and all these types of things, and there's going to be job losses and changes in the end. There's going to be a lot of stuff that happens as an economy and an industry evolves, right? And so it's not a clean transition, but I do believe we're getting there. But I think it's going to be long and slow. It's not happening real fast. It's going to take a long time, but I believe that is the direction we're certainly.
Sure. And the part two to that was strong fortress balance sheets are better for the safety of depositors, but is there a downside to fewer players in the market?
Yeah, if one fails, it's a bigger issue, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's it, right? I mean, if you're right, if you were talking about balance sheets being buttressed, right, by being larger, right, and having more diverse business interest, right? The more diverse you are, one industry has a shock, it doesn't create such an issue with the bank, right? Silicon Valley, right, is tied obviously to tech. You can see where that becomes a problem, right? So yeah, I mean, larger balance sheets buttressed up by that. The fact that these larger banks seem to have some type of relationship with the government, whatever it may be, right? There seems to be something going on there. Yeah, I think that's generally a positive thing. I think it promotes stability, yes, unless one of them fails, right? If Citigroup or if JP went down tomorrow for some reason, that would be a dumpster. Right now, I don't know how that happens anytime soon, but then again, we've been surprised by stuff before, so that's the danger, right? That is the danger.
Yeah. We have just a couple more and then we'll log off here. But the first one here is Warren Buffett is in talks with the White House on investing in regional bank amid crisis. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, Warren certainly is an opportunistic investor, right? I mean, he is a value investor, and so he would, if he's doing that, right? There's a reason for it, right? He sees that these banks are, especially these regionals that he's talking about, whichever ones they happen to be, are probably there's probably been overreaction. Their share prices have been suppressed. There's an opportunity for an investment with a good upside there. Plus, of course, if you know Warren at all, right? Warren gets involved in the operations of businesses that he invests in, right? He gets people on the board, right? That's just the way he's been operating for a long time. which means he probably sees potential and don't discount the fact, right? As I mentioned, a lot of these smaller regionals and such have been acquired, that type of thing. Warren makes money, right, if he invests in a regional bank, right, and he gets the thing acquired by a larger bank, right, because he's going to make money on that deal. So it's not just that he's trying to buttress the industry. There is value for him there, whether either through just propping up the bank itself or packaging it up really nicely and selling it. Either way, Warren and Berkshire make money. So just take that with a grain of salt.
Perfect. And our last rather opinion for the night is thoughts on oil and gas stocks in 2023.
To me, yeah, that's off topic here for me. I have not played in oil and gas stocks for a while. I mean, there's a lot of things happening within the energy sector, right? There's a lot of government incentives and things happening that are, well, incentivizing doing, other, alternative energy sources rather than using oil and gas, right? So there's a lot of pressure coming from all kinds of different ways that, it's negative pressure on oil and gas. Now, does that mean that they're going to be beat up anytime soon? They're not disappearing tomorrow? No, right? But to me, there's way too much noise. There's way too much turbulence there. It's just not a place that I feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable investing. I also don't feel comfortable investing in emerging energy markets either, because I think so many of them, because just like cryptos, right? I'll put those like cryptos. Emerging energy and cryptos I consider similar in the fact that we don't know who the winners and losers are going to be. There are going to be winners and losers, right? But we don't know who, right? And so because of that, it's the volatility is high and the risk is high. And so unless you have insight into some kind of something specific and you want to speculate, great. But in terms of just a hold type of investment, I've stayed away.
Excellent. Peter, thank you so much for your time this evening and participating in our speaker series. We greatly appreciate it, and we want to thank everybody for joining our session this evening.
Well, thank you all for joining as well. And anytime you need to reach out to me when you have questions, you know where to find me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and we hope everyone has a great evening. Take care.
Have a great evening.